Trump had assumed that a personal jab about Jasmine Crockett's marriage might rattle her. Instead, less than a minute later, it became the spark for a moment that stripped away his credibility before a live, nationwide audience. Inside the Phoenix Convention Center, the air was dense with anticipation, a kind of tension you could almost taste. 100 feet of blazing stage lights bore down on two podiums, separated by a modest table scattered with water bottles and loose note cards. Behind them, the American flag hung proudly, its edges rippling gently in the manufactured breeze. From overhead fans, every seat in the hall was taken, business suits beside denim jackets, MAGA caps beside buttons calling for change. At the far end, cable news cameras formed a silent wall, their red tally lights blinking like warning signals. This wasn't just another political gathering. It was a prime-time live town hall, President Donald Trump and Representative Jasmine Crockett, broadcast across multiple networks. No pre-written scripts, no safety nets. Every word was happening in real time, every glance and gesture recorded forever. Crockett had walked in fully aware of the stakes. Her team had warned her. Trump was unpredictable, often steering conversations into territory far from policy, but she hadn't come to trade insults for entertainment. Her focus was on jobs, education, and healthcare in communities that rarely made the headlines. Backstage, just minutes before stepping out, she'd taken a quick look at the crowd. Veterans adjusting their caps, parents bouncing children on their knees, clusters of college students whispering excitedly while gripping their phones. But what struck her wasn't their variety. It was their mood. The air felt charged, like everyone was waiting for something unplanned to unfold. She chose her outfit carefully, a sharp navy blazer over a cream blouse, simple gold earrings, her hair neatly pulled back. Not for him, but so that anyone watching would see someone calm, steady, and in control. When the time came, the moderator, a composed, even-toned journalist named Brian Talbot, stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, and Representative Jasmine Crockett." The applause was uneven, some enthusiastic, others restrained. Trump entered with his familiar grin, shaking a few hands in the front row before taking his podium. Crockett followed, offering a polite nod toward the audience. The early exchanges went as expected: border security, the economy. Crockett was prepared. She had numbers on unemployment rates, stories of small businesses recovering in overlooked towns, and sharp observations about infrastructure shortcomings. Trump countered with sweeping claims of economic success, crediting himself for job growth. But there was something in the way he looked at her after each response. A brief pause, a measuring glance, the faint curl of a smirk. She noticed it but kept her shoulders square, her voice steady. By the third segment, the discussion turned to health care. "Representative Crockett," Talbot said, "you've spoken often about improving access to rural hospitals. How would your plan work in sparsely populated areas?" She outlined it: state partnerships, funding expansions, mobile medical units. Mid-sentence, she saw Trump shift, leaning on his podium like a man about to interrupt. She kept her pace, refusing to let him break her rhythm. People in the crowd were listening intently. A woman in the second row whispered to her teenage son, gesturing toward the stage. Crockett caught the movement from the corner of her eye and smiled briefly before continuing. Trump didn't speak yet, but his gaze stayed locked on her. She recognized the look. She'd seen it in hearings before. It was the prelude to a calculated attempt to throw her off balance. Somewhere in the back, a cameraman moved his tripod, the red tally light swinging toward her. She knew that was the shot they'd cut to for her reaction, so she made a conscious choice to keep her expression neutral. When Talbot wrapped her answer and turned to Trump, he leaned into the microphone. "Well, I think it's a lot of talk. She likes to talk. Maybe she should focus more on keeping her own household in order before telling the country how to run its hospitals." It wasn't the direct hit he was clearly circling, but it was close enough to stir a few murmurs in the audience. Crockett inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the moderator rather than Trump. The tension in the room tightened. Talbot tried steering things back to policy, but both of them knew the conversation had shifted. She could feel it. A moment was approaching. The audience didn't realize it yet, but they were about to witness one of the most replayed political exchanges of the year. Trump was edging toward a line he didn't know she'd been waiting for him to cross, and when he did, she was ready. Brian Talbot kept his questions short. No rambling setups, no speeches disguised as inquiries. But tonight there was an unmistakable edge in his delivery, as if he sensed these two weren't just separated by policy differences. "Representative Crockett," he began, "you've spoken often about accountability in federal spending. Can you give us a concrete example of where the current administration has fallen short?" Jasmine Crockett didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. We have millions of dollars going to programs with zero measurable outcomes, while rural hospitals are shutting their doors and schools are cutting staff. That's not just inefficiency, it's negligence. And it's hurting ordinary people." Her tone stayed even, but each word landed with precision, like stones skipping cleanly across still water. She still hadn't looked Trump's way. She wanted her points to sink in before she gave him the satisfaction of a glance. Trump adjusted his microphone. "Look, I think the Congresswoman is mistaken. We've done an incredible job, probably the best job, managing this country's finances. Record growth, record jobs, the best numbers you've ever seen." Crockett's lips curved slightly, somewhere between a smile and a smirk. "Mr. President, if those numbers were truly helping everyday Americans, they wouldn't be choosing between buying medicine and keeping the lights on. Growth on paper doesn't pay a family's electric bill." A smattering of applause rose from the audience. Trump's eyes flicked toward them, then back at her, his head tilting just enough to look like he was sizing her up. The next topic was foreign policy. Trump went first, painting sweeping pictures of strength, leverage, and international respect. Crockett listened silently, her pen tapping once or twice against her notepad. When her turn came, she didn't open with a rebuttal. She told a story. "Last month in Yuma, Arizona, I met a young veteran who served 2 tours overseas and came home with injuries he'll carry for the rest of his life. He told me the disrespect he felt didn't come from combat. It came from how our VA treated him after he got back. If we're going to talk about respect, we should start with those who've already given everything for this country." This time, the applause was louder. Trump's face stayed composed, but his eyes cut toward the cameras. He didn't like losing the crowd's attention. Education came next. Crockett spoke on teacher shortages in rural areas and how they fed into wider economic instability. Trump countered with a call for higher teacher performance and a swipe at unions. The exchange grew sharper, quicker. She'd answer, he'd fire back, and vice versa. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Trump's tone was drifting, away from policy, inching toward the personal. The pauses before his responses were shorter, his interruptions a little more pointed. When Brian asked about bipartisan cooperation, Trump leaned into his microphone with a grin. "I'm always willing to work with people, so long as they're not just here to make themselves look good on TV like some people tonight." A few people laughed. Crockett let it slide, but she filed it away. This wasn't a debate to him anymore. It was theater. Her next turn came with a healthcare question, and she noticed his posture change. Trump leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the side, eyes fixed on her like he was waiting to pounce. She spoke steadily about funding gaps, patient access, and structural reforms. Then the first crack in the evening's structure appeared. He cut in mid-sentence. Maybe if she spent less time giving speeches and more time at home, she'd understand real priorities. The audience reacted, half gasp, half nervous laughter. It wasn't the full hit, but it was a warning shot. Crockett paused, just long enough for the moment to register, then finished her answer without acknowledging the jab. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Brian tried to keep things moving, but the shift was obvious. Their exchanges had more bite now. Their stares lingered longer. Trump was pushing toward something, and Crockett could feel it. Not as a threat, but as an opening she might use if he went too far. Still, she wanted the country to see she was there for policy, not personal drama. That distinction would matter when the line was finally crossed. It was during a segment on rural health care that the tension finally reached a boil. Talbot posed a straightforward question. "Mr. President, you've often criticized Democratic healthcare reform proposals. How would you address the ongoing closures of small-town hospitals?" Trump answered in broad terms, blaming past administrations, promising to look into it, and taking a swipe at poor management. And then, almost like he couldn't help himself, he turned toward Jasmine Crockett. "You know, maybe if she spent more time dealing with real problems instead of chasing the spotlight, her marriage wouldn't be falling apart." The words landed like a sudden break in rush-hour traffic, jarring, sharp, impossible to ignore. The reaction wasn't a single clean gasp. It was fractured. A few laughed under their breath. Others muttered in disbelief. From somewhere in the back, a man's voice rang out, "Come on!" Crockett didn't flinch. She stayed exactly where she was, hands resting lightly on the podium, gaze fixed on him. The cameras found her instantly, capturing that steady, unblinking. "Look, that said, I heard you, and I'm deciding how to answer." Brian Talbot shifted in his chair, clearly uneasy. "Let's try to—" But Trump cut in again. "All I'm saying is, before you tell the country what to do, maybe make sure your own house is in order. No euphemisms, no polite phrasing." This was personal. Crockett drew in a breath through her nose, held it for a heartbeat, then let it go slowly. In her head, a clock started ticking. She had two options: fire back instantly, or make the room lean forward, waiting. She chose the second. "Mr. President," she began, her voice low but perfectly clear for the microphones, "my marriage is none of your business, just as the personal lives of every American woman you've ever tried to put in her place are. None of yours." The room rippled. Applause from one section, murmurs from another. Trump leaned on his podium with a smirk, like he'd been waiting for her to lose her composure. She didn't. Her tone stayed measured. "But since you brought it up," she continued, "maybe this is the right moment to remind everyone that leadership is not about mocking women or tearing down families. It's about serving the public with integrity." Someone in the third row clapped loudly enough to be picked up by the mics. Another voice called out, "That's right." Trump tried to speak, but Brian lifted a hand toward him. "Let her finish, Mr. President." Crockett didn't break eye contact. "If you think my worth is tied to my marriage, then you've misunderstood the people who sent me here. They didn't elect me to be anyone's wife. They elected me to fight for their jobs, their health care, and their future." Applause broke out again, louder this time. Even a few who had been sitting stiffly earlier were nodding. Trump shifted, his stance no longer quite as amused. "That's—" he began, but Crockett raised her hand, palm out. "You had your turn, now it's mine." The hall erupted with cheers. The momentum had shifted. Every lens was pointed at her now, every mic tuned to her voice. Trump leaned back, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He wasn't used to losing control of the pace. Crockett closed her remarks by steering right back to the topic at hand. "Now, if we're done talking about my personal life, let's talk about why rural hospitals are closing while pharmaceutical companies post record profits. Because that's the conversation the American people deserve." The applause this time was sustained, rolling across the hall. Brian glanced between them, fully aware this exchange would lead every headline for the next 2 days. But Crockett wasn't finished. As she prepared to pivot from defending herself to dismantling his political narrative, The insult still hung in the air, irreversible, undeniable. Trump had taken it personal, and in doing so, changed the tone of the night. The cameras caught every subtle shift in her expression afterward. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She let the silence breathe, heavy and deliberate. People in the crowd leaned forward, sensing something was coming, but not knowing how sharp the next hit would be. Crockett wasn't just thinking about him. She was thinking about the millions. Who would watch this tomorrow in living rooms, on phones, in workplace break rooms? If she went too hard, it could be spun as her losing her cool. Too soft, and it would vanish into political noise. Trump, from his podium, seemed certain she'd either stumble or overreach. He adjusted his microphone, ready to jump on her next move, the faint curve of a smile tugging at his mouth, convinced. He'd won the moment, but Crockett had no intention of playing by his rules. Her eyes swept the crowd slowly, the middle-aged man in a work shirt smudged with grease, the older woman clutching her purse tight, the college student in the back live-streaming on her phone. This was no longer just a debate stage. This was her chance to speak directly to the country, using him as the perfect example of what she wanted to call out. In her head, she began the countdown. 3. Mr. President, she began, her voice steady yet charged with conviction, you just told millions of people watching tonight that a woman's worth is tied to her marriage. That's not leadership. That's a slap in the face to every woman who's worked twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously. A ripple went through the audience, part applause, part murmurs, but she didn't slow. You want to talk about keeping one's own house in order? She pressed, her tone sharpening just enough. Let's talk about the one you've occupied for the last 4 years. Let's talk about promises made and promises broken. Let's talk about the real priorities of the American people, the ones that can't be trimmed into a soundbite. Trump shifted his stance, gripping the podium with both hands. He stayed, silent this time. The moderator, Brian Talbot, made a motion to step in, but Crockett carried on. Her words began to flow with a deliberate pace, conversational in delivery, yet carrying the rhythm of a closing argument. She lowered her voice just slightly. I was raised by a father who told me never to let anyone else decide my worth, and tonight, I'm telling every young girl watching, you do not need a man's permission to be powerful. Not your boss's, not your president's, not anyone's. The applause swelled. Even the moderator glanced at her with something like respect. She wasn't just speaking to him now. She was speaking through him. Each sentence was both a rebuttal and a reminder that his attack had backfired. Trump adjusted his tie, muttering something into the microphone, but his words were lost under the roar of clapping. The smirk was gone, replaced with the look of someone who realizes they're no longer steering the conversation. Crockett leaned toward the camera. And for the record, Mr. President, my marriage is strong. Not because it's flawless, but because it's built on respect. Something this country could use a bit more of from its leaders. The crowd rose to its feet, clapping, cheering. Amid the noise, Trump's voice finally broke through. Okay, fine, you've made your point. She didn't let him finish. It's not a point, sir. It's the truth. The words landed like a drum beat. Short, final, and unanswerable. Brian jumped in, trying to steer things back. All right, let's return to health care policy. Crockett gave a small smile and nodded, letting him take the floor. She'd landed her first real blow, but she wasn't done. Before she aimed, for the knockout, she wanted to link his insult to something bigger, something that could expose cracks in his entire presidency. The cameras were locked on the stage, but the energy in the room had shifted. Her last line hadn't just steadied the moment, it had turned it. Now Trump was left standing with an insult that hung in the air like an unwelcome odor. Representative Crockett, Brian prompted again, let's return to rural health care. But she didn't move on. She could feel the audience leaning in, waiting. And you don't throw away a moment like that. Here's the thing, she said, gesturing toward the crowd. When a president chooses personal attacks over policy, you have to ask, is this about leadership or is it about ego? Heads nodded. People in the front row murmured in agreement. Her tone shifted. Less like she was debating, more like she was speaking directly to the public. Mr. President, you turned a discussion about saving hospitals into a conversation about my marriage. But I think Americans are done with leaders who punch down instead of lifting people up. Trump leaned toward his mic. All I'm saying is, if you want to fix something, you start at home. Crockett didn't blink. And if you want to be president, you start with respect. The applause erupted again, this time louder and longer. Cameras caught Trump glancing at the crowd, just for a moment. But a moment that mattered. She pressed forward, her voice gathering rhythm. We have towns in places like Elko, Nevada, and Muncie, Indiana, losing their only hospital within 50 miles. We have mothers driving hours just to give birth and seniors missing critical treatments because the closest clinic has shut its doors. And tonight, instead of addressing any of that, the president chose to focus on my marriage. The difference between those realities was so sharp you could almost feel it settle over the entire room. Trump tried to pivot back to his talking points. We've got the strongest economy in the world, more jobs than ever before. People are thriving under my administration. She didn't give an inch. Tell that to the coal miner in Logan, West Virginia, who just had his third medical bill sent to collections. Or the teacher in rural Kansas working a second job just to afford insulin. Do you think they care whether I'm married or whether I'm trying to get them health care? Someone in the audience shouted, "Tell him!" And the hall erupted in cheers again. Trump raised his eyebrows, clearly unaccustomed to losing control of a crowd in real time. He started to speak, but Crockett was already ahead of him. This, she said, is why people grow cynical about politics. They think it's all theater. And when the president turns serious issues into personal jabs, it only proves them right. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can tackle the real problems without tearing each other apart. She wasn't raising her voice, but each word landed with purpose. The microphones caught every syllable in crisp detail, the way good live audio does when the speaker truly owns the room. Brian leaned forward. Congresswoman, are you saying you believe the president's approach to this debate has been counterproductive? A shifted slightly toward him, though her gaze stayed locked in Trump's direction. I'm saying the American people deserve better than counterproductive. They deserve leaders who can take a tough question without making it personal. And if I can take one tonight, so can he. The cheers were almost constant now, pockets of the audience rising to their feet. A CNN camera panned across faces, young, old, left-leaning, right-leaning, but for the moment, united. Trump pressed his lips together and reached for his water bottle. It was a small gesture, but it told the story. He needed a beat. Crockett. Use that beat to press her advantage. I've been married for 12 years, Mr. President. And in those 12 years, I've learned that respect isn't about agreeing on everything. It's about knowing when not to cross certain lines. Maybe that's something Washington could learn from the rest of America. The audience responded with a mix of applause and knowing laughter. All right, Brian said carefully. Let's move to the next question. But the point had already been made. She'd taken his insult, reframed it, and turned it into a statement about her values. And she wasn't stopping there. Now she was ready to take the fight from personal defense to a direct critique of his presidency. As Brian shuffled his notes, trying to regain control of the tempo, Crockett leaned slightly toward her mic, her tone conversational but precise. You know, Mr. President, since you decided to bring my personal life into a national debate, let's talk about something personal for the American people. The way your administration's decisions have reached into their homes, their paychecks, and their futures. The room quieted. Even those who had been fidgeting moments ago turned their attention forward. Trump tilted his head, arms crossing loosely. "Here we go," he muttered into the mic, just loud enough for the crowd to hear. Crockett didn't. "Look away. You've spent a lot of time tonight talking about record jobs and the best economy. Let's get specific. Wages in rural counties like Knox County, Missouri, haven't kept pace with inflation. Small-town grocery stores are disappearing because corporate chains have squeezed them out. Family farms are collapsing after generations because subsidies don't reach the people working the land. They go to big corporations with lobbyists in Washington." There were murmurs, some approving, others bristling, but she kept pressing forward. "You say America is winning, but for the woman in Clay County, Arkansas, deciding between filling her gas tank or buying her child's asthma medication, it doesn't feel like winning. For the veterans in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, still waiting months for basic VA care, it doesn't feel like winning." Applause began in small clusters and spread. Trump gestured toward the crowd. "We've done more for veterans than any administration in history. Everybody knows that." Crockett turned to him, voice steady. "Then why do they keep telling me they're being left behind? Are they all wrong, Mr. President?" He hesitated, just enough for her to continue. "And since you brought women's lives into the spotlight, tonight let's talk about that. You've attacked women on Twitter. You've interrupted them in meetings. You've questioned their intelligence on national television. And here's the truth. It's not just about me. It's about the message that sends to every young girl watching. It tells her that no matter how hard she works, no matter how prepared she is, no matter how firmly she stands her ground, there will always be someone waiting to tear her down." It started with something entirely unrelated to her record, yet the crowd answered with a rolling wave of applause. Some rose to their feet again, the sound ricocheting off the tall walls, blending with the soft whir of cameras pivoting to catch every frame. Trump leaned closer to his microphone. "You've got plenty of opinions and so-called facts," she interjected without raising her tone, drawing a ripple of laughter from a pocket of listeners. With a deliberate step toward her lectern, she steadied herself. "I've been in enough courtrooms to recognize when someone tries to steer away from the real question because they lack a solid answer. And, Mr. President, when you turn a debate about policy into a jab at someone personally, that's exactly what you're doing, avoiding the actual issues. But I'm not here to avoid anything. I'm here to talk about the people who elected me, and they're not asking me to defend their pride. They want me to protect their paychecks, their health, and their future." Brian glanced toward Trump, as though expecting him to interrupt. But he didn't. That pause gave Crockett the opening she needed to complete her shift in direction. Her gaze swept the room, locking eyes with scattered members of the audience. "If you're watching this from your living room tonight, remember, you deserve leaders who can face hard questions without firing off cheap insults. You deserve a government that doesn't treat leadership like entertainment. And you deserve a president who keeps the focus on your needs, not their own." That closing note drew an even louder round of applause than before. Trump unfolded his arms and gripped the microphone, leaning forward like he was ready to seize the moment. "You can talk all you want, Congresswoman, but talking doesn't get things done." She met his stare. "Neither does belittling the people who are trying to." The crowd reacted instantly, a mix of cheers and whistles. Brian jumped in, eager to move along. "All right, let's take our first question from the audience." But the atmosphere had shifted entirely. She was no longer just holding her position. She was steering the exchange, and the audience was matching her rhythm. The moderator was still introducing the next question when the change became undeniable. It wasn't just applause now. It was a current of energy that lingered between her answers, as though the room had decided she'd earned their attention. A man in the fifth row wearing a scuffed leather jacket rose with the microphone. "Mr. President," he began, "I voted for you in 2016 and again in 2020. But I'll tell you, I didn't come here to hear you talk about this Congresswoman's marriage. I came to hear what you're going to do for people like me who can't afford their prescriptions." His words brought scattered claps and even a whistle from the back. Crockett didn't flinch or smile. She let the statement sit in the air, waiting for Trump's reply. Trump gave a courteous nod, though the tension in his jaw was visible even from a distance. "We've lowered prescription costs." The man shook his head. "Not for me, you haven't?" It was subtle, but the mood tilted further toward her side. Brian then moved to a woman from Flagstaff, Arizona, who addressed Crockett directly. "Congresswoman, what would you do differently to keep rural hospitals open?" Crockett leaned toward the microphone. "First, we stopped treating healthcare as if it's optional. We fund small-town hospitals the same way we fund highways, because lives depend on them. We closed the loopholes that let giant insurance companies make record profits while refusing to cover basic treatment. And we make sure no one has to choose between keeping their home and paying for cancer care." The woman nodded, visibly affected, and applause swelled again, this time from corners of the room that had stayed quiet earlier. Trump tried to step back in. "We've already done incredible things for healthcare, but no one gives us credit." He was cut off by a young veteran from Pahrump, Nevada, speaking before Brian could stop him. "With all due respect, Mr. President, if you've done all these incredible things, why am I still waiting 9 months for a VA appointment?" The room reacted. Murmurs, scattered cheers. Crockett stayed still, her eyes fixed on the veteran in a silent acknowledgement. Trump nodded. "We'll look into that." She seized the opening. "Or, Mr. President, we could admit the system is broken and fix it, instead of promising to look into it for another 4 years. That drew quick applause and a few shouts of agreement. It wasn't that Trump had lost the room completely, his base was still vocal, but the momentum had shifted. More people were backing her, more were willing to press him directly. From the stage's edge, a cameraman tightened his shot on her face. The control booth recognized what it had, a challenger standing toe-to-toe with the president, the audience leaning her way. Sensing the shift, Brian lobbed her another question on the economy. She answered with a vivid picture. A family-owned hardware store in Ottumwa, Iowa, shutting down after 6 decades because it couldn't compete with corporate chains. A dairy farmer in Madison, County, Georgia, forced to sell off his herd as feed prices soared. "These aren't just headlines," she said. "These are real people's lives, and they're tired of leaders talking at them instead of actually hearing them." The audience broke into loud applause, louder than before. Trump glanced at Brian with a flicker of impatience, as if hoping the moderator would redirect the conversation back toward him. But Brian didn't step in. Crockett turned slightly toward Trump. "You can say the economy's doing great, but until the people living paycheck to paycheck actually feel it in their wallets, it's just talk." That landed hard. People rose from their seats, clapping and shouting. Some remained standing long after the noise began to fade. Trump tried to jump in. "Nobody's done more," but Crockett didn't even look his way. She kept her focus on the audience, letting their reaction carry the moment. Finally, Brian stepped forward. "We'll take one final question from the audience before we move into closing statements." But the mood in the room had shifted. This was no longer just a debate. It was a momentum swing, and Crockett was riding it. The last question came from a middle-aged nurse from Prescott Valley, Arizona. Holding the microphone in both hands, she spoke directly to Crockett. "Congresswoman, I've worked in healthcare for 22 years. I've seen ERs so overcrowded that patients wait in hallways. I've had to tell people they can't get the medicine they need because their insurance won't cover it. What will you do to make sure nurses like me can actually help our patients?" Crockett didn't rush. She nodded toward the nurse, her voice softening with respect. "First, thank you. I've spent enough time in hospitals to know the weight nurses carry, and you shouldn't have to do it with your hands tied." She stepped closer to the edge of the stage, narrowing the space between herself and the crowd. "Here's my promise. We will fully fund rural and community hospitals so they can stay open. We will put a cap on the cost of life-saving medication, period. And we will hold insurance companies accountable for every single denial with penalties steep enough to make them think twice before putting profits over people." The applause came quickly, growing louder by the second. Trump leaned into his microphone. "We've done more for healthcare workers than any administration in history. Everybody knows that." Crockett turned toward him, steady. "If they knew it, Mr. President, they wouldn't still be standing here asking for help." The response was met with another wave of applause, this time sharper, almost expectant, as if the crowd was starting to anticipate her quick rebuttals. Brian checked the clock. "All right. It's time for closing statements. Representative Crockett, you'll begin." Trump's eyebrows lifted slightly. Starting with her meant she would get the final word of the night. Crockett stepped up to the microphone, resting both hands lightly on the podium. "Tonight, you heard a lot about numbers, record jobs, the best economy, so they say. But numbers don't tell the whole story. People do. I hear from parents who have to choose between rent and groceries, from veterans still waiting for medical care, from nurses like the one we just heard from who are doing the work of three because the system keeps cutting corners." She paused, letting the silence fill the room. "We can do better, and doing better starts with leaders who listen, who respect you, and who answer the hard questions without trying to distract you with personal insults." Trump shifted slightly, waiting for his turn. Crockett's voice grew firmer. "When you attacked my marriage tonight, you didn't just attack me. You attacked every woman who's ever been told her worth depends on the man standing beside her. I will not stand for that. Not here, not in Washington, not anywhere." The hall erupted, cheers, clapping, even shouts of, "That's right," from the back. She leaned in, speaking into the swell of energy. "America doesn't need a president who judges people by their personal lives. America needs one who measures themselves by the lives they've made better." The applause surged again, filling the space. Brian motioned to Trump for his closing statement. Trump spoke for several minutes, returning to familiar points about economic growth, military power, and his vision for the future. He didn't mention the marriage remark again, a silence that spoke for itself. When he finished, Brian thanked both candidates and began wrapping up, but Crockett wasn't done. She stepped back to the mic, breaking from the format. "One last thing," she said, her tone softer but just as sharp. "To every young person watching, especially young women, don't let anyone else define your worth based on something they can use against you. Define it yourself. Stand in it, even when they try to knock you down." The crowd rose, most of them, not just a few, clapping, cheering, filling the room with sound that lingered even as the cameras rolled. Trump offered a tight smile, but the image that would play across every news broadcast the next morning was unmistakable. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall at the podium, the crowd behind her. The real test of her night's impact wouldn't be measured in the applause. It would be measured in what came next. The political storm was already brewing, set to explode the moment those 47 seconds hit the internet. By the time the I-Day stage lights dimmed and the moderator offered a final thank you to the audience, the night's most electric moment was already slipping away from the room, fragmented into phone alerts, reposted videos, and buzzing text threads. Backstage, Crockett's team was moving fast. Her communications director, Lorna Whitfield, had one earbud in, tuned to an MSNBC producer. "They're already running it," she murmured, a grin tugging at her lips. "It's everywhere." Crockett took a slow sip from a paper cup of water, careful not to show too much satisfaction. She knew how quickly the political spotlight could swing away, but this wasn't just a headline. This was the kind of exchange that stuck. Her phone vibrated in her hand, 3 missed calls from Hill colleagues, a dozen unopened texts, and an alert from Twitter. Jasmine Crockett is trending. She opened the app just long enough to see her "neither does" line looped endlessly with captions, then shut it before getting caught in the feed. Out in the press area, reporters crowded near the rope line, tossing questions at anyone willing to stop. One of Trump's aides swept past without a word. A political analyst spoke into a camera nearby. What we witnessed tonight was one of the most effective real-time counterpunches in a presidential forum in years. She didn't just defend herself. She turned the power dynamic on its head. Meanwhile, Trump held his own post-event huddle in a side room. The mood was noticeably different. He repeated his talking points from the stage, but the questions kept circling back to his marriage remark. "Do you regret saying it?" one asked. "Why bring it up?" pressed another. He brushed them off, calling it lighthearted, but the TVs in the background told a different story, a moment spinning out of his control. Across the country, the clip replayed endlessly on living room screens, bar TVs, and phone feeds. In a Reno diner, two older women leaned over their coffee. "I don't even agree with most of her politics," one said, but she shut him down without raising her voice. That's skill. In a small Fresno apartment, law student Damon Alvarez shook his head with approval. That's how you handle a cheap shot. You stay calm, stay sharp, and keep the focus on the bigger picture. Even some conservative commentators, while attacking her policies, acknowledged she handled the moment with precision. One late-night panelist admitted, "Look, I backed the president, but he walked straight into that one. She was ready." By midnight, the clip had racked up more than 4 million views. Hashtags like 47 seconds and Nar Crockett clapback trended alongside slow-motion edits of her delivery. Lorna's phone buzzed non-stop with interview requests from Good Morning America, CNN, The View. "Everyone wants you tomorrow," she said as they headed for the waiting black SUV. In the quiet of the ride back to the hotel, Crockett finally let out a breath. She wasn't naive. Trump's base would defend him, and by morning the moment would be spun a dozen different ways. But she also knew something rare had happened, a moment that couldn't be dismissed as luck. Her husband, Marcus, had sent just 2 words, "Proud of you." That was enough. By the time she reached the hotel, late-night hosts were already weaving it into their opening jokes. 47 seconds, one quipped. "I've seen microwave dinners take longer." The audience roared, but beneath the laughter was a clear truth. She had flipped the script. Morning editorials split sharply. Crockett seizes moment in televised showdown versus Trump stumbles, opponent gains ground. Cable news filled the screen. With side-by-side footage, Trump on one half, Crockett on the other, while commentators dissected every detail, her timing, her tone, the steady hold of her gaze. Through it all, Crockett stayed on message. "This isn't about me. It's about the American people and what they deserve from their leaders." But she knew the spotlight brought its own risks. Moments like this didn't just elevate a profile, they painted a target. It was nearly 1 a.m. when she stepped into her Phoenix hotel room. Outside, the city was still. She kicked off her heels, set her phone on the desk, and stood in the quiet. The muted television flashed familiar images. Trump's jab, her unflinching stare, the rebuttal, the crowd's reaction. Lorna had already started calling it the clip, as if it had taken on a life of its own. Crockett crossed the room, picked up the remote, and turned the volume back on. A morning news promo was already teasing the replay. The broadcast was wrapping up early for the East Coast, setting the stage for the story of how Representative Jasmine Crockett turned a personal jab into a defining political moment. She powered off the TV and exhaled slowly. Her phone rang. Her husband. "I saw it live," he said, his voice calm and grounding, the way it always was after she'd weathered something heavy. "You didn't let him get under your skin." "I couldn't," she replied. "Not with the whole country. Watching. If I'd made it about me, the point would have been lost." "You made it about everyone else," he told her. "That's why it landed." After they hung up, she poured a glass of water and sat by the window, gazing at the empty street below. Her mind drifted to the people she'd brought up during her remarks. The coal worker in West Virginia, the nurse from Arizona, the veteran from Pennsylvania. She thought, too, of the young women who might have been watching, hearing her say, "No one else gets to define their worth." But she knew the cost. A moment like this could rally supporters, yes, but it could also invite attacks, far uglier than the one she'd just faced. The political world rarely let things fade quietly. Then she remembered the faces in the crowd. Not just allies, but those who had walked in doubtful, maybe even hostile, and had left leaning in, listening. That was the point. Not to win every single vote, but to cut through the noise long enough for people to truly hear you. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, the one she used for thoughts she didn't want to lose, and scribbled, "Stay steady. Strike when it matters." Always bring it back to them. Somewhere across town, Trump was probably telling his team he'd gotten the better of her. But the footage painted another picture, the pause she'd let hang before answering, the way she'd redirected the spotlight from her personal life to his public record, the gradual shift of the crowd, one question at a time. That was the lesson she hoped people would take. You can't always choose the moment, but you can choose your response. And sometimes, if you choose well, you can take a hit meant to knock you down and use it to stand taller. Setting her pen aside, she glanced at her phone again. Messages kept pouring in from friends, colleagues, strangers. One from a high school student in Topeka read, "I've never seen someone handle a guy like that live on TV. Made me feel like maybe I could do it too someday." That one stuck with her the most. By the time she crawled into bed, the adrenaline was fading, but the clarity remained. Moments pass, headlines fade, but the way you carry yourself when the lights burn brightest, that lingers. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more think pieces, more online noise. Some would cheer her, others would attack. That was politics. But tonight, as she closed her eyes, she knew she'd done more than win a soundbite. She'd shown that leadership isn't about who can shout loudest, it's about who can hold their ground with purpose. And to anyone watching, whether in a crowded convention hall or on a phone in a quiet kitchen, her message was simple. Don't let anyone else write your story for you. So if this moment means anything to you, let it be this. Strength isn't the absence of attack. It's knowing exactly who you are and making sure the world knows it too. And if that resonates, share the story. Keep the conversation alive, and push for a world where leadership is defined not by volume, but by vision.